I am a 22-year-old mom, at home on the computer in the front room, my kid napped in the adjoining room. Front door swings open and a Hispanic guy, round 5'6" and 180 walks in. I wasn't initially alarmed, as we had a Hispanic family move in a few doors up the street recently. I figured he was in the wrong place. I tell him calmly he is looking for the other house. He gives no inclination of understanding. I more forcefully tell him, and again nothing. At this point, I am getting alarmed. I am tiny 5'3" and 90 pounds at the time, and the room is a simple office, not a lot of weapons. The third time I yell for him to get out. My biggest fear is waking the kid who hasn't been sleeping long. For some reason I looked at the kid's closed door when I yelled, and the intruder followed my gaze. Then he took a step towards my kid's room. In that moment I knew I would die before I would let him through that door. A quick survey of my surroundings reminded me I had scissors and my pencil cup on the desk. I buried those scissors so far into his abdomen I cut my own hand on the handle. Then I jerked them towards me as hard as I could. Blood went everywhere. His eyes got huge and then he ran back out the door. The police followed the blood trail for several blocks, but assumed he was picked up when the trail stopped. They sent an officer to every hospital in the area, but he never went for treatment. I had to have HIV tests for 2 years after since our blood mingled. No idea what happened to him, but he lost a lot of blood. To this day I lock my door even if I am just going to the car. My kid still rolls his eyes when I tell him I would hurt someone intending to do him harm. A few months ago, my parents moved to a small village and I had to attend a new school. The house next door, 2 hours, was owned by a crazy old woman. She spent her day sitting all alone on a bench in front of the house and muttering to herself under her breath. One day, when I was walking by, I noticed that she seemed to be petting something that was sitting in her lap. At first, I thought it was a cat, but when I took a closer look, I realized there was nothing there. She was just holding her hand above her knees and stroking thin air. Perhaps she had a pet cat or a dog once, I thought, and it died, and in her disordered mind, she thinks it's still there. I felt sorry for the old woman and with a sigh, I continued on my way. Then, one night, when I was sleeping soundly in my bed, something strange happened. I woke up to feel something hairy lying by my side. It gave me a fright and I jumped off the bed. Just then, I noticed a shadow moving out of the corner of my eye. It went across the floor and out the door. I was startled, but when I calmed down, I realized it was probably just some stray cat or dog that had wandered into the house. That was when I happened to glance out my bedroom window and saw the crazy old woman next door. She was standing on the sidewalk, under the street light. Her long, gray hair was hanging loose and fluttering in the wind. Her eyes were wide and she was looking directly at me. I was so scared that I jumped back from the window. Then, the woman turned and went back inside her house. It took me a long time to calm down, but eventually, I went back to bed. As I was drifting off to sleep, I remembered something that struck me as odd. When I saw the shadow of the stray cat or dog running out of my room, it didn't really seem as if it was running. It seemed more like it was rolling across the floor to the door. The next morning, when I woke up, I got dressed and went downstairs to eat breakfast. On my way to school that morning, I passed by the old woman's house again. As usual, she was sitting there on the bench, muttering to herself and stroking something invisible in her lap. When I passed by, I distinctly heard her say, "What were you doing? Why did you run away from me last night? Look how you scared that girl." I got a queasy feeling in the pit of my stomach and it made me shiver. It was all I could do not to start running. At school, I decided to ask my friends about the old woman. No one really knew anything, except that she had been released from a mental hospital about 10 years ago. They said she had a history of mental problems, and that was why everyone kept away from her. Since her release, all she did was sit all day on the bench outside her home. A few days later, my father struck up a conversation with an old man who had lived in the village all his life. When my father asked him about the old woman, he had a very chilling story to tell. He said that the old woman had spent over 30 years of her life in a mental institution. When she was young, she had been married and she and her husband had lived together in the same house. According to him, she suspected for years that her husband was cheating on her, but he always denied it. Then, one night, she caught him with another woman. She hacked him to death with an axe and cut off his head. When the police came, she was sitting on the bench in front of her house with an insane grin on her face. The severed head of her husband was in her lap, and she was talking to it and stroking it gently. A young man and his wife were on a trip to visit his mother. Usually they arrived in time for supper. They had gotten a late start, and now it was getting dark. They decided to look for a place to stay overnight and go on in the morning. Just off the road, they saw a small house in the woods. Maybe they rent rooms, the wife said, so they stopped to ask. An elderly man and woman came to the door. They didn't rent rooms, they said, but they would be glad to have them stay overnight as their guests. They had plenty of room, and they would enjoy the company. The old woman made coffee, brought out some cake, and the four of them talked for a while. Then the young couple were taken to their room. They explained that they wanted to pay for this, but the old man said he would not accept any money. The young couple got up early the next morning before their hosts had awakened. On a table near the front door, they left an envelope with some money in it for the room. Then they went on to the next town. They stopped at a restaurant and had breakfast. When they told the owner where they had stayed, he was shocked. "That can't be," he said. "That house burned to the ground 10 years ago. The old man and woman who lived there died in the fire." The young couple could not believe it, so they went back to the house. Only now there was no house. All they found was a burned-out shell. They stood staring at the ruins trying to understand what had happened. Then the woman started screaming. In the rubble, there was a badly burned table, and on the table was the envelope they had left there that morning.